The early morning sun had barely peeked through the airport windows as passengers shuffled through the boarding gate of Flight 2317. Among them was a man in his mid-30s, wearing a comfortable navy blue sweater and dark jeans. He'd been flying for over 15 years, though not usually as a passenger. Today was different. He needed to reach Denver for his next shift as a commercial airline pilot. As he made his way through the business class cabin, rolling his carry-on beside him, he noticed the supple shift in atmosphere. The flight attendant at the entrance, who had been warmly greeting other passengers, gave him a quick once-over, her smile noticeably cooling. He was used to this. The quick judgments, the assumptions. After thousands of flights and years in the industry, he'd seen it all before. "Excuse me, sir," the flight attendant called out as he started placing his bag in the overhead compartment of his assigned first-class seat. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Her voice carried that familiar tone, polite on the surface but laced with doubt. A few nearby passengers glanced up from their phones and magazines, some with curiosity, others quickly averting their eyes from the scene unfolding. "Yes, I am," he replied calmly, pulling out his boarding pass. "Seat 3A. He'd learned long ago that staying professional was the best response. The flight attendant took his boarding pass, examining it with unnecessary scrutiny, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the paper. "This is unusual," she muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "These seats are typically reserved for our premium customers." The emphasis on premium wasn't subtle. Two older men in business suits across the aisle exchanged knowing looks. With practiced patience, he pulled out his frequent flyer card, platinum status, earned from countless hours in the air. "I fly this route often," he explained, his voice steady and dignified. The flight attendant's expression tightened as she realized she couldn't find any reason to challenge his presence further. "Very well," she replied curtly, handing back his boarding pass. "Please ensure your carry-on is properly stored." She moved on quickly, her warmth returning as she greeted the next passenger, an older woman in designer clothes who received a bright smile and an offer to help with her bag. As he settled into his seat, he pulled out his phone, sending a quick text to his wife. "Made it on board." The usual welcome wagon. Her reply came seconds later. "Their loss. Show them what class really means." He smiled, tucking the phone away as the cabin crew began their pre-flight preparations. Looking out the window, he watched the ground crew going through their checklist. He could spot the subtle signs of incoming weather, the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon, the way the windsock moved erratically. His pilot's instincts were already analyzing the flight conditions ahead, though none of the crew knew they had an experienced captain sitting among their passengers. The flight attendant from earlier passed by several times during the boarding process, each time managing to brush past his seat without acknowledging him, while cheerfully checking on other passengers' comfort. He noticed how she'd lean in to chat with other first-class passengers, offering them pre-flight drinks and magazines, while he sat waiting, invisible to her selective service. A young businessman in the seat next to him was busily typing on his laptop, but had observed the supple dynamics playing out. He caught the pilot's eye and gave a small shake of his head, clearly disapproving of the treatment. It was a small gesture, but a reminder that not everyone shared the flight attendant's prejudices. As the final passengers boarded and the cabin door closed with its characteristic thunk, he could hear the muffled voices of the flight crew doing their pre-flight checks through the cockpit door. The familiar sounds brought a slight smile to his face, if only they knew that one of their own was sitting just a few rows back. But for now, he was content to remain just another passenger, watching as the morning light grew stronger and the airport began to buzz with increased activity. Little did anyone know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary, and all these small moments of prejudice would soon be overshadowed by events that would force everyone aboard to reconsider their hasty judgments. The plane had been in the air for about 30 minutes when the first signs of trouble began to show. Through the window, dark clouds loomed ahead, their massive shapes casting shadows that seemed to swallow the horizon. The pilot had his eye trained on these gathering storms, conscious of every slight movement that passed through the cabin. He noticed things that regular passengers might miss: the subtle shake in the flight attendant's hand as she passed out drinks, the frequent glances between crew members, the way they kept disappearing behind the curtain for hushed conversations. His years of experience had taught him to read these small signs like a book. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign due to some expected turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." The same flight attendant who had questioned his presence earlier now moved through the cabin with quick, nervous steps. Her previous attitude had been replaced by visible concern as she checked everyone's seatbelts. When she reached his row, she barely made eye contact, but he could see the worry lines creasing her forehead. Through the thin walls of the aircraft, he could hear fragments of radio communication that most passengers would ignore. But he understood every crackled word, every code phrase. The pilot was requesting clearance for a route change, but from what he could gather, air traffic control was pushing back. The surrounding airspace was congested, making deviation difficult. A young mother across the aisle clutched her child closer as the plane shuddered slightly. The businessman next to him gripped his armrests, his laptop long forgotten in its bag. The pilot watched as another flight attendant whispered something to her colleague, their faces tense with concern. He pulled out his phone, opening his weather radar app, a habit from years of flying. The storm system ahead was massive, spanning hundreds of miles. The plane's current trajectory would take them right through one of the most volatile sections. His experienced eye could tell this wasn't just ordinary turbulence they were heading into. The cabin lights flickered briefly as another shudder ran through the plane. A few passengers gasped, and someone in the back dropped a drink. The flight attendants exchanged another worried look before one of them disappeared behind the cockpit door. He could hear raised voices through the door, not angry but urgent. "Everything okay up there?" A nervous passenger called out to a passing flight attendant. Her smile was tight and professional, but her eyes told a different story. "Just some weather ahead," she replied with forced cheerfulness. "Nothing to worry about." But the pilot knew better. He could feel it in the way the plane was handling, could see it in the increasingly agitated movements of the crew. Something wasn't right. The flight attendant who had treated him so dismissively earlier now paced the aisle, her previous arrogance replaced by barely concealed anxiety. Through the window, he watched as they entered the edge of the cloud bank. The smooth blue sky disappeared, replaced by swirling gray masses that engulfed the wing. The light in the cabin dimmed, as if the clouds were slowly swallowing them whole. He knew from experience that the real challenge lay ahead. This was just the beginning. He overheard fragments of another conversation between crew members. "The captain's not feeling well. Alternative route. Medical kit." The words were hushed, but in the tense atmosphere of the cabin, they seemed to echo like thunder. Several passengers were now openly showing signs of distress. An elderly man gripped his rosary beads, lips moving in silent prayer. A teenager had stopped playing her game, earbuds dangling forgotten around her neck as she stared wide-eyed out the window. The businesswoman in front had closed her laptop and was taking deep, measured breaths. The pilot remained calm, his mind already running through scenarios and solutions. Years of training had taught him to stay level-headed in crisis situations. He could tell from the increasingly erratic movements of the plane that the situation in the cockpit was deteriorating. Whatever was happening up front, it wasn't just about the weather anymore. As if confirming his thoughts, the plane took a sudden dip, causing several passengers to yelp in surprise. The flight attendants stumbled, grabbing onto seat backs to steady themselves. One of them rushed to the intercom, her voice shakier than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure your seatbelts are tightly fastened. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence." The pilot knew that moment would come soon, the moment when his expertise would be needed. He could sense it in the growing tension, in the increasingly worried looks of the crew, in the way the plane handled. For now, though, he waited, watching and assessing, knowing that timing would be crucial. The real test was yet to come, and when it did, all those prejudices and assumptions would fade away in the face of something far more important: survival. The crisis struck without warning. A flight attendant burst through the cockpit door, her face pale with panic. She grabbed the intercom phone, trying to keep her voice steady. "If there's a doctor on board, please press your call button immediately." The pilot watched as 3 call buttons lit up above different seats. His own finger hovered over his button, but not to signal medical expertise. He knew that whatever was happening in the cockpit was about to change everyone's lives. 2 doctors rushed forward, One, an elderly man with silver hair, the other a young woman still wearing hospital scrubs from her shift. They disappeared behind the cockpit door as passengers craned their necks, whispering anxiously among themselves. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time, as they pushed deeper into the storm system. Through the thin walls, raised voices could be heard from the cockpit. Blood pressure dropping, severe stomach pain, can't focus. The words drifted back to where the pilot sat, painting a clear picture of the situation. The captain was in serious trouble. The young mother across the aisle hugged her child closer as the plane took another sharp dip. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. "Just a bit of bumpy weather." The child began to cry softly, and several passengers turned to look, their own fears reflected in their eyes. The cockpit door opened again, and one of the doctors emerged, speaking urgently to a flight attendant. "He needs immediate medical attention. This isn't something we can handle in the air." The flight attendant nodded, her earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of crisis. The co-pilot's trying to handle it, but with this weather. Lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating the cabin in a brief harsh light. Thunder followed immediately, so close it seemed to shake the entire aircraft. A businessman 2 rows ahead began to hyperventilate, and a flight attendant rushed to bring him a paper bag. The co-pilot's voice came over the intercom, strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency with our captain. Please remain calm and seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're doing everything we can to handle the situation." But the pilot could hear what wasn't being said. The co-pilot's voice carried the edge of someone fighting to maintain control. Another violent shake rattled through the cabin, and overhead bins popped open, spilling bags onto the aisle. The flight attendants scrambled to secure them, their movements becoming increasingly frantic. Through his window, he could see the wing flexing against the brutal forces of the storm. The plane was flying through the heart of the weather system now, and without an experienced hand at the controls, they were in serious trouble. The co-pilot was fighting both the weather and the responsibility of sudden solo flight. A challenge that could overwhelm even seasoned pilots. A flight attendant stumbled past, clutching seats for support. The pilot caught her arm gently. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since he boarded. "The captain, he's really sick. Food poisoning, the doctors think." "And the co-pilot?" She glanced toward the cockpit, leaving the sentence unfinished. The plane dropped suddenly, lurching sickeningly to one side. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, dangling like yellow flowers in a storm. Screams erupted throughout the cabin as passengers scrambled to put them on. A baby started wailing somewhere in the back, its cries piercing through the chaos. The flight attendant who had been so dismissive earlier now stood in the center aisle, her knuckles white as she gripped a seat back. Her voice shook as she made the announcement everyone had been dreading. "If there are any licensed pilots on board, please identify yourself immediately. This is an emergency." The cabin fell silent except for the roar of the storm and the occasional cry of a frightened child. Passengers looked around, hoping, praying for someone to stand up. The pilot took a deep breath, remembering his wife's words, "Show them what class really means." Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The same flight attendant who had questioned his presence in first class stared at him, recognition and realization dawning in her eyes. Without a word, he reached into his carry-on and pulled out his pilot's license and credentials. "I'm an airline captain," he said calmly, his voice carrying through the silent cabin. "I've flown this exact aircraft type for the past 10 years. The relief that washed over the flight attendant's face was mixed with something else, shame, perhaps, or regret. As he walked toward the cockpit, passengers watched him pass with a mixture of hope and desperation in their eyes. The elderly man with his rosary beads whispered a prayer. The young mother managed a grateful smile. The businessman who had witnessed his earlier treatment nodded respectfully. Just before he reached the cockpit door, a massive lightning bolt lit up the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The plane bucked like a wild horse, and for a moment, chaos reigned. But the pilot's steady walk never faltered. He had a job to do, and right now, nothing else mattered. Not the prejudice, not the earlier treatment, not even the storm raging outside. As the cockpit door opened, he could see the co-pilot struggling with the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. The captain lay slumped in his seat, attended by one of the doctors. The situation was exactly as bad as he had feared, but now, at least, they had a chance. The cockpit was a scene of controlled chaos. Medical equipment was scattered across the floor, the captain's face was ashen as he lay semi-conscious in his seat, and warning lights flickered across the instrument panel like an angry Christmas tree. The co-pilot's hands were shaking slightly on the controls as he fought to keep the aircraft level. "I'm a captain with 15 years of experience," the pilot said calmly, holding out his credentials. "I'm rated on this aircraft type and current on all certifications." The co-pilot's relief was visible as he quickly scanned the documents. Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had treated him so poorly earlier stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "He flies the same routes as us," another crew member whispered to her. "He's one of our senior captains from the Western Division." The first flight attendant's face flushed red as the realization sank in. She had spent the entire flight looking down on someone who was actually her superior in every professional sense. The young doctor attending to the sick captain looked up. "He needs immediate medical attention. His blood pressure is dropping, and he's showing signs of severe dehydration." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cockpit in stark white light. The plane shuddered violently. "We need to get him out of that seat," the pilot said, his voice steady and authoritative. As they carefully moved the sick captain, the co-pilot explained the situation. They were caught between two massive storm cells, their planned alternate routes were blocked by other traffic, and they had about 40 minutes of fuel buffer remaining. The pilot nodded, already sliding into the captain's seat and adjusting it. His movements were smooth and practiced, hands moving across the controls with familiar ease. The co-pilot watched in amazement as he quickly assessed every gauge and display, building a mental picture of their situation. Back in the passenger cabin, word had begun to spread. "He's a pilot." The businessman who had sat next to him whispered to his colleague. "But they treated him like—" His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. The young mother who had been clutching her child looked up hopefully as the flight attendants hurried past with medical supplies. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your new captain speaking. I understand this situation is concerning, but I want you to know you're in good hands. I've been flying this route and this aircraft type for many years. We're currently working with air traffic control to find the safest path through this weather system. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The change in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate. His confident tone and professional demeanor seemed to calm the worst fears. Even the crying baby in the back quieted down. The elderly man with the rosary beads smiled and nodded as if his prayers had been answered. The flight attendant who had questioned his first-class ticket now stood in the galley, hands clasped tightly together. Her colleague touched her arm gently. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. But they both knew that was exactly the problem. She had made assumptions based solely on appearance, and those assumptions had been completely wrong. Through the cockpit door, passengers could hear the pilot's calm voice speaking with air traffic control, using the technical language of aviation with easy familiarity. The co-pilot's responses became more confident as they worked together, their professional rapport building quickly in the face of crisis. One of the passengers, a young girl who had been watching everything with wide eyes, tapped on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, is it like in the movies? Did the hero come to save us?" The mother smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "Sometimes, sweetheart, real heroes don't look like the ones in movies. Sometimes we don't recognize them until we really need them." The business class passenger who had witnessed the earlier discrimination was typing rapidly on his phone. "Just saw something incredible," he wrote to his wife. "Remember what I told you about that passenger they were being rude to? Turns out he's an airline captain. Now he's flying the plane through this storm. Talk about karma." In the cockpit, the pilot was fully in his element. His hands moved surely over the controls as he studied the weather radar, planning their route through the storm. The co-pilot watched in admiration as he coordinated with air traffic control, managed the aircraft's systems, and kept everyone calm, all while dealing with severe turbulence and deteriorating weather conditions. "I've got to admit," the co-pilot said during a brief moment of calmer air, "I'm really glad you were on board today. The pilot smiled slightly but kept his focus on the instruments. "We all face storms in life," he replied quietly. "What matters is how we handle them." Outside the cockpit, the flight attendant who had shown such prejudice earlier was preparing the cabin for possible emergency landing. Every time she passed the now empty first-class seat where the pilot had sat, she felt a fresh wave of shame. She had judged him so quickly, so unfairly, and now he was the one ensuring their survival. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The man they had looked down upon was now the one they were literally looking up to for salvation. As the storm raged outside and the plane pushed through the turbulence, one thing became crystal clear: competence, skill, and character had nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with what lay beneath the surface. The regional airport appeared through breaks in the clouds like a beacon of hope. The pilot had guided them through the worst of the storm, but now came one of the most challenging parts: landing in difficult conditions with over 200 lives depending on his skills. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring, "we're beginning our final approach. The weather has improved somewhat, but we may still experience some turbulence. Please ensure your seatbelts remain fastened and all loose items are secured." In the cockpit, he worked in perfect sync with the co-pilot, years of experience evident in every movement. "Flaps 15, he called out, his hands steady on the controls. The co-pilot responded promptly, and the plane adjusted its configuration for landing. Through the rain-streaked windshield, runway lights flickered in the distance. Wind gusts still buffeted the aircraft, but the pilot's touch on the controls was so sure that passengers barely felt the turbulence. The medical team had secured the sick captain in the cabin, and emergency services were standing by on the ground. "Flight 2317, you are cleared for landing on runway 27, the tower controller's voice crackled through their headsets. "Wind 290 at 25 knots, gusting to 35. The pilot acknowledged calmly, already adjusting their approach to account for the crosswind. In the cabin, passengers pressed their faces to the windows, watching the ground get closer. The young mother held her child tight, whispering, "Almost there, sweetie. Our hero pilot is going to get us down safe and sound." The elderly man with his rosary beads had finally stopped praying, confidence in the pilot's abilities having replaced his earlier fear. The flight attendant who had shown such prejudice stood in the galley, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. Every smooth adjustment of the aircraft was another reminder of the skilled hands now guiding them to safety. Hands she had so quickly judged and dismissed hours earlier. 1,000 feet, called out the co-pilot, running through the landing checklist. The pilot nodded, his focus absolute as he lined up with the runway. Rain streaked across the windshield, but his eyes were locked on the approach lights ahead. 500 feet, came the next call. The plane rocked slightly in a gust of wind, but the pilot's correction was immediate and precise. In the cabin, passengers could feel the aircraft settling into its landing configuration, the familiar whine of the landing gear extending below them. The businessman who had witnessed the earlier discrimination was now filming the approach on his phone. "You won't believe what happened on my flight today," he narrated quietly. "Sometimes the real heroes are the ones we least expect." 200 feet. The runway was clearly visible now, wet pavement reflecting the aircraft's landing lights. The pilot made tiny adjustments, compensating for the gusting crosswind with the skill that came from thousands of landings. 100 feet. The co-pilot's voice was steady, confidence in his new colleague evident in every word. The pilot's hands moved smoothly across the controls, managing their descent with precise inputs. 50 feet, 40, 30. The ground rushed up to meet them. The pilot pulled back slightly on the controls, timing the flare perfectly. 20, 10. The touchdown was so smooth that some passengers didn't even realize they had landed until they felt the thrust reversers engage. The pilot guided the aircraft down the wet runway with the same steady hand that had brought them through the storm, gradually bringing them to a safe stop. Applause broke out in the cabin, spontaneous, heartfelt, and thunderous. Passengers who had been strangers hours ago hugged each other in relief and joy. The young child who had been so frightened earlier jumped up and down in her seat, clapping with excitement. The flight attendant who had questioned the pilot's presence in first class felt tears in her eyes as she listened to the passengers' reactions. The contrast between her earlier behavior and his professional excellence was a lesson she would never forget. Emergency vehicles approached the aircraft, their lights flashing through the rain. The pilot completed his shutdown checklist with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the flight, then turned to the co-pilot with a small smile. "Nice work up here," he said, giving credit to his colleague despite having done most of the flying himself. The co-pilot shook his head in admiration. "That was the smoothest landing I've seen in these conditions. We all learned something important today, and not just about flying." As they stood up to help coordinate the medical evacuation of the sick captain, the pilot's movements were still calm and purposeful. There was no trace of resentment or anger about his earlier treatment, no hint of satisfaction at proving his critics wrong. He was simply a professional doing his job with excellence. Through the cockpit window, they could see the emergency teams approaching in the rain. The storm that had caused so much trouble was moving away now, and bits of blue sky were beginning to show through the clouds. It seemed fitting somehow, a reminder that even the darkest moments can lead to clearer skies, especially when guided by skilled and generous hands. The terminal buzzed with activity as passengers from Flight 2317 shared their incredible story with waiting family members and airport staff. The sick captain had been rushed to the local hospital, where doctors reported he was responding well to treatment for severe food poisoning. But in the quiet moments after the emergency, something even more remarkable was unfolding. The flight attendant who had questioned the pilot's first-class ticket stood near the gate desk, gathering her courage. She had spent the last hour watching him coordinate with ground crew, check on the sick captain's condition, and help passengers with their connections, all without a single mention of how she had treated him earlier. Finally, she approached him as he finished speaking with the airline's operations team. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I owe you an apology. The way I treated you earlier." She paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate. "I made assumptions that were completely wrong, and I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior." The pilot turned to face her, his expression kind but serious. "We all have biases," he said quietly. "The question is what we learn from them." He glanced around at the bustling terminal. "I've been flying for 15 years, and I still get questioned about whether I belong in certain spaces. But today wasn't about proving anything, it was about doing the job I was trained to do." Nearby, passengers who had witnessed the earlier interaction were watching this exchange. The businessman who had documented everything was typing rapidly on his phone, sharing the story with his company's diversity and inclusion team. "Witnessed something today that would make the perfect case study," he wrote. The young mother approached with her child, who was now wearing plastic pilot's wings that a ground crew member had given her. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes conveyed much more. "My daughter wants to be a pilot now. She says heroes come in all kinds, and sometimes the best ones are the ones people don't expect." The airline's regional manager arrived, having heard about the incident. After reviewing the situation, he made an immediate decision. The video of the flight attendant's discriminatory behavior and the pilot's professional response would become part of the airline's mandatory training program. Not as a moment of shame, but as a learning opportunity about prejudice and professionalism. "We're implementing new training protocols," the manager announced to the assembled crew. "This incident has shown us we have work to do, but it's also shown us what real leadership looks like." He turned to the pilot. "Your actions today saved lives, but your response to adversity might save something even more important, our ability to grow and learn from our mistakes." The co-pilot, who had watched everything unfold from the beginning, stepped forward. "I've learned more today than in years of training," he said, "not just about flying through storms, but about handling the storms of prejudice with grace and professionalism." Word of the incident spread quickly through the airline's internal channels. By evening, the story had reached the corporate offices. The next morning, a new policy was announced. All staff would undergo enhanced bias awareness training, using this incident as a cornerstone example of both what to avoid and how to make things right. The flight attendant who had shown such prejudice asked to be part of this initiative. "I want to share my story," she told the training department. "I want others to learn from my mistake, to understand how quickly we can jump to wrong conclusions, and how those conclusions can blind us to the incredible people right in front of us." As the pilot packed up his flight bag, preparing to finally head home, he found a stack of thank you notes from passengers. One caught his eye. A crayon drawing from the young child, showing a plane flying through clouds with the simple words, "Thank you for showing me that heroes look like everybody." The businessman approached one last time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you could have made this into a huge issue. You could have demanded her job, filed complaints, gone to the media. Instead, you turned it into a teaching moment. That's real leadership." The pilot smiled slightly as he shouldered his bag. "Sometimes the best response to prejudice isn't to fight it with anger," he said. "It's to prove it wrong with excellence." He glanced at his watch. He had another flight to catch, another crew to work with, another chance to lead by example. As he walked through the terminal, several passengers from the flight nodded in recognition. The flight attendant watched him go, then turned to her colleague. "I'll never make that mistake again," she said quietly. "And I'll make sure others learn from it too." The story of Flight 2317 became more than just a tale of an emergency landing. It became a powerful reminder that excellence knows no color, that true professionalism shines through in the darkest moments, and that sometimes the best way to change minds isn't through confrontation, but through quiet competence and unwavering dignity. The pilot's final words to the crew before he left became part of the airline's new training manual. "We all face storms in life. Some are in the sky, some are in our minds. The key is to navigate through both with skill, grace, and the willingness to learn from every experience."